I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. My main area is epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. So I'm interested in a range of issues connected to that, like nature of truth, evidence, reasons, rationality, and so forth. So I think the best way to confront this kind of question is to first off think about what inquiry is. So good inquiry is geared towards the truth, and that means that it's sensitive to the evidence that's relevant to that inquiry. Now, like as opposed to bad inquiries where you're just sort of mindlessly trying to find things out, but you're not really going anywhere. Good inquiries, they're geared towards the truth and they follow the evidence. But ultimately, whether something's true isn't dependent on us. I mean, it's just dependent on the way things are. It's not about what we think the world is like, it's what it really is like. So it can both be true that vaccines are a good thing for a population, something to get, and also that there are these odd cases where people have adverse effects. And of course, we've got to be careful here because you have to show that it's really because of the vaccine. This idea that truth is just relative, it's a lot of people hold it, but if you think about it, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, of course, it can be true that your experience, it's true that, as I say, one's experiences are different, other people's experiences, but still, that's an objective truth. It's still objectively true that your experiences are this, that someone's experience is that. So it's still, as it were, independent of you, right? It's just that it's your experiences that it's an objective truth about you that your experiences were like that. I mean, what counts as a scientific truth will have to meet the standards of evidence for that domain. So it would be true, right? It'd be true your experience is such and such, but for it to count as a scientific truth, then it would depend on the domain. So if one's running studies on, vaccine effects of vaccines, you're doing some sort of trials, that your evidence isn't going to be just anecdotes. It's going to be, you're going to have a structure to it. You're going to go out and record, so you'll go out and find out about what people's experience is, and then you'll extrapolate from that and start to see how, so are there alternative explanations for those experiences of the vaccine and so on. And then once you've gone through all that and collated it, then it becomes evidence, right? It becomes good evidence for a certain claim, a claim about the vaccine and about its effects on the population. Insofar as the question is a scientific question, there's no better thing to trust than science because it is the authority on that question. But there's two big provisos to this. More, but two I'll mention. The first is that not everything that's presented as science is science, right? So often you'll get in these scenarios, sort of bad actors presenting what they have as science. So it's really important that the people really do have the credentials, they really know what they're talking about in this domain and so on. And a related thing here, by the way, and I think this crops up a lot in the COVID pandemic, you want to know that the expertise is specific to the scientific claim. Remember I said before, we've got different parts of science. You could have a scientific expertise that's very good on epidemiology, let's say, but it's not so good on, or in fact, you even had cases where you had scientists who had nothing to do with epidemiology, but suddenly they were pronouncing about epidemiology. So there's kind of like a sort of expertise drift, as it were. Because someone's a good scientist over here doesn't mean they're a good scientist over here.
I know, yeah.
Particularly, I think, in a policy, public policy type issue like a pandemic, a lot of the questions that we're asking aren't specifically scientific. They're questions about what we ought to do. And I think that's not a scientific question. It's a scientific question, like what's going to happen if we, if this and what happens. But, ultimately, from a public policy perspective, what we should do is not a scientific question. That's a political question. Things I saw a lot in the social media was people saying, follow the evidence, follow the science. Well, yes and no. I mean, if by that you mean listen to the scientists, well, yes. But if you mean that, we should only listen to scientists, that's not right. Because they can't tell us what to do. I mean, ultimately, you have to make political decisions. You've got to decide. Are you closing things down? Are you rolling out vaccinations? What these are public policy questions. Someone has to take an overall judgment about these things.
Yeah,
and that's politics. Unfortunately, that's the only way to do it. You get knowledge when you form your beliefs on a good basis from an epistemic point of view. And that means on the basis of good reasons and evidence and so on. And, if you're a knower, then you're the kind of person who is responsive to reason. So you don't just carry on believing something even when all the evidence changes. You have to change your beliefs to fit with the evidence. And that's what we want from people in this case as well. What's tricky, of course, is that we live in this media, in this social media saturated, information saturated environment where we're inundated with information and we have to sift through it. And that's very hard. when they read things, they shouldn't just immediately believe them. They should learn how to be skeptical of them. But they also should know, like, how far to push that. You shouldn't be skeptical of everything, right? You've got to judge your sources. Some things warrant more skepticism than others, and so on. You need to be able to weigh them up. I think a lot of people think that if the scientists change their mind, that somehow means it was never science. But that's actually part of what it is to be science. It's be open-minded, to follow the evidence wherever it takes you. I think that all of us have certain background. A famous philosopher called Wittgenstein called hinge commitments. They're like basic commitments in the background, which structure how we think about the world. And we all have that. And they change over time. And they, to some extent, socially determined. The broadly scientific way of viewing the world, I think, over time becomes part of this background. It's just part of how we think about the world. How the sort of worldview that we have, this background worldview, just determine what we take seriously and what we don't. For what it's worth, I don't think... some people think religious belief is essentially irrational or something. I don't think that at all. So I think it's important things to be aware of them and aware of the role that they might have in our reasoning. You're right to trust the people that care about you and you're close to. You're right to trust them. As you say, they have your best interests at heart. The evidence has some credibility. But that doesn't mean you have to accept it, hook, line, and sinker, right? You can still, have a look at it, examine it, talk about it, try and work out, right? So people had a reaction. How do they know it was the vaccine? How do you know? Well, some people do have reactions. So how do we know that this is? How do I know I'll have the reaction and so on? Vaccines are an interesting case as well because, generally speaking, you should be able to refuse treatments. But the thing about vaccines is that if you do refuse treatments, it has a bearing on other people. This is different. Normally, you refuse treatment, it has a bearing on you. Vaccines, if lots of people refuse it, it has a bearing on everyone else. So, one has to factor that in. Maybe if there are some side effects for you, but maybe, one should accept that because there's a social good here, right? This is going to help other people not to get ill and so on. So here's what's a dangerous thing, gullibility. And gullibility isn't the same as trust. Gullibility is you just believe whatever you're told. That's what the gullible person does. That's not good. That's not ever a route to knowledge. It's not trust that's the problem. It's right to trust people. Right, as I say, I think it's right. You're right to trust those around you have your best interests. But what we want to prevent is that becoming gullibility, kind of a blind trust, just a blind acceptance of whatever you're told, because that's the enemy of knowledge. So you might think, well, yeah, maybe I will get some side effects, but maybe the side effects will be mild. Maybe I accept that it would be good for the population as a whole. And it will give me some protection and so on. So you can start weighing up these evidence. And knowledge is when you get to the truth in a way that's through reasons. It's not, you get to the truth in a way that's grounded in reasons and not grounded in just happenstance. Lucky guesses aren't knowledge, but reasoning your way to the truth, that is knowledge. The thing with conspiracy theories is, yes, you have to address it. Once you're in the grip of conspiracy theory, then it's too late. Then we need to get people before they're in the grip of a conspiracy theory. Because once you're into that, the problem of being in that state is whatever evidence you're given becomes itself like part of the conspiracy. So you're in a kind of hole now. You can't even listen to the evidence. But I think part of the solution is to stop people getting there in the first place, educate the intellectual virtues, help people to think more clearly for themselves. And then also, I think, be more honest about what science is and what it offers. So a lot of conspiracy theories, I think they get some mileage from the fact, if they think science is sort of presenting itself as settled fact about things where the facts aren't settled, and then that can give a lot of fuel to conspiracy theory. Skepticism, I think, is a good thing. We should all be skeptical in a moderate sense. We should all try and sort of have the attitude of being circumspect about the evidence we give, reflect on it, come to our own minds and so on. That in itself doesn't lead to conspiracy. And in fact, actually, if it's properly done, it prevents you from getting conspiracy theory because the idea is that you're skeptical because you care about the evidence. The challenge is to find ways of realizing that the skepticism shouldn't lead to conspiracy theories. Here's another thing I would say. Conspiracy theories don't benefit the people that they're from. I mean, often you find this on social media, that people propagating conspiracy theories don't believe them themselves. It's a way often of keeping people down, I think. I think a lot of people on social media, that they don't want people to believe in the truth. They don't want people to believe in evidence and reasons and so on. They want them to be people who are just accept conspiracy, be gullible and so on. Because that's the easiest way to manage people, the easiest way to control people. And I think what we have to understand is that it's the liberating power of reasons, right, and evidence. This is a way of liberating ourselves from these lies, these fictions that are designed, I think, to contain us. And I think there's important truth here that, the people who are opposed to truth are usually the people, they believe in truth themselves. They just don't want other people to believe it, right? Because they're in power, and their power is threatened by this. It's reasons, evidence, open inquiry, open information. These things are conducive to a good and open society, which is, I think, embraces important democratic principles and helps us to overcome the very kinds of prejudices that you're talking about, which undermine public trust. I think one of the things that emerged with the pandemic is a real problem with how science and public policy intersect, particularly when it comes to managing risk. So as you said in your question, early on in the pandemic, the science was very tentative, it was speculative. Even the practitioners would concede this, right? But they were, as it were, the scientists in their modeling were very risk averse, which you can understand why they might be like that. So they don't want to, from a scientist's point of view, if you've got to make predictions, you're going to err on the side of caution, right? Because if you go on the side of caution and you're wrong, that's one thing. But if you don't go on the side of caution and you're wrong, then obviously they will come back to haunt you. Yeah. So they were being, I think, overly risk averse. And then on top of that, the politicians, I think, were being additionally overly risk averse. So they were they were taking this as gospel. And then they were also thinking in their assessments, well, I have to be even more risk averse because, again, the same reasoning, it'll come back to haunt me if I'm, better to be more risk averse than less. So I think we were sort of edging towards an overly risk averse response to the pandemic. I mean, that's just my sense of it. And it seemed as things moved on and we got more information, we started to edge back from that. But I think it's understandable that people are risk averse, but I think we need to find a way to manage that. I think part of what's going on is that people are worried about, once this is all over, who's going to take the blame, which is, obviously a big issue. We have to trust our public servants and the scientists that advise them to give the best advice and not necessarily the most cautious advice. Yeah, the other thing here is, because I said before, everything in a society is interconnected. Yeah. So when you're risk averse along one axis, you're going to end up being less risk averse along another. Yeah. I mean, so one thing that happens with the pandemic is, we lock down the NHS. We know a lot of people will die of cancer. There's a lot of people who would have lived, and now they're going to die of this cancer. So in one sense, we're avoiding risk along one axis, but we're creating risk along another axis. The hesitancy, as I say, is rational, right? I mean, it's rational. If you have reasons to think that, authority is not to be trusted, then, when authority comes around again and asks you to trust, then it's rational to be hesitant. And it's important from like a public policy point of view, it's important to understand the sources of this hesitancy. I mean, I think one thing that happened with COVID, which I think is quite unpleasant, if anyone expresses any kind of skepticism about it, they all get labeled as they all get characterized as the same. They're all deniers. They all get bundled together. And I don't think that's very helpful. Even I remember early on, people who were making really quite mild points about, they were accepting the science, but just mild points about the public policy ramifications. And they were just sort of, told that they didn't care about the NHS or something. It was all very, very dogmatic. And I don't think that helps anyone. Those kind of blanket denunciations. We need to have a really nuanced way of responding to this. The hesitancy can be rational. We should accept that. That in itself doesn't lead to vaccine denial. It's when the hesitancy becomes something like, a blanket refusal to engage with this. And as you say, you have to deal with the systemic problems as well. I mean, that's because that's a political issue. That's not anything that the scientists can help with, but it's certainly a problem that has to be done. I do think that concern for evidence, truth, knowledge, that's part of the solution here. And then when it comes to specific groups that have vaccine hesitancy, I think we have to understand the sources of them. And in particular, that means not just, we shouldn't vilify vaccine skeptics. I think we should try and understand them. And in particular, we shouldn't lump them all in together. There's lots of different reasons. As you say, people can have very good reasons to be skeptical of authority. And so, to lump them together with people who are just sort of cranks, it doesn't help anybody. We have to understand it because that's the only way to get through this.